So hi everyone, my name is Emily LoPresto. I'm a ceramic artist and thanks for joining me. So what you're seeing behind you is a mess of my studio. So I'm going to do a little studio tour, talk about my process, and we'll take it from there. So thanks for joining me. And so I'm using my iPad, so I'm going to be carrying you around and flipping around a little bit, so bear with me. Okay, so welcome to the studio. So my studio is in my basement in my home, and most of what you see here is either from IKEA or I built it myself. So we have old dining room tables. Two of the tables I built. This is my kick wheel that I use as basically a big banding wheel. So this half of the studio is typically for working on clay. And then this half of the studio is for working with plaster. If you get plaster in your clay when it's wet, it's not good for the clay. So then this side over here, this is where I mix my plaster. This is where I clean my plaster. And then this is my new glazing table for this year. It has some pots on it. But I added this table this year because I was glazing on a shelf and that was not working. So my studio, so you cannot rinse and clean off clay things in normal plumbing. So this is my sink that I clean everything in. And then this is a shelf that typically has work that needs to be fired on it. This is one of my mold shelves. This is where I keep molds that I don't use as often or have been discontinued. And then over here, we have, so this is sort of a multi-use shelf. While I'm mold making, I use it to dry molds. And while I'm working with clay, I use it to dry the clay pieces themselves. These are some things I cast last night. And then this is where I store all of my stuff for mold making. So this is the stuff to make the mold itself. That bin right here is full of vinegar water, and that's where I clean my molds when they're done. And then this is more supplies for mold making on the bottom. So here's a little overview of the studio. And then when you come around to this side over here, so I should mention that the studio used to just be this part of the basement, and it has now become the entire basement. So right here is my little kiln that fires all of my work. So I'll flip around. So it's not very big. Here's me standing. Here's the kiln itself. So I've had that for about 2 years, I believe. So a little bit about having a ceramic studio in your home. Ceramics is a little bit of a toxic process. So I have a vent coming from my kiln that vents all the fumes out of the window. This is my test kiln that I can use if I need to test colors or just fire one thing if I don't have it for an order. This is my little woodworking studio. So there's my chop saw. I have a mini, there's pole holds at my house. I have a mini bandsaw, and then I have a mini belt sander as well. That's my new storage shelf for this year. I used to keep all my work kind of all over the place, and now it's nice and organized. I was planning on expanding it, but then I can no longer go to IKEA. So those guys are going to be moved over here eventually. So then here's all of my sad art fair bins because they are going to be down here for a very long time. But this is everything that I use to transport my work when I take it to shows. And then I've got my shipping stuff there as well. This is my wood storage section. And then over here is my photography studio. So I have, there's the lights, camera, where I take pictures of my work. And this is my white background photography studio as well. So let me take you back over to the main part of the studio. Okay. So, all right, so bear with me on the adjusting. So the first thing I'm going to explain about my process, is there any questions about the studio? No? Okay. So the first thing I'm going to explain about my process is that when I'm making my pieces, the color that you see on the piece is the clay itself. I stain the different colors. So I have 6 different colors of clay, and then there's a clear glaze over top of everything. So I have these little carts. Da-da-da. So right here is my Bermuda in pink clay, and I wheel them around, and when I use 2 clays at a time. And then on top of the carts here are my slip mixers, because to save my back, because I used to mix with a drill. So right now I'm working with my Bermuda in pink clay, and so I'm just gonna show. So this bowl right here is pink and Bermuda. So I already cast this part in the pink. This is the mold for that bowl. And then I'm going to put on the top. I'm going to take the Bermuda clay, and I'll show you once I pour it. Pour it in, and then you wait. It's very exciting. So let me flip you around again. So here is a typical mold being poured. I overflow my mold so that the top can be cut and cleaned up later. So there's the pink clay, there's the Bermuda clay. And then I'm gonna do a little unmasking like a cooking show. So that's casting. And so this is the mold for my 1-color vases that people are quite fond of. It's not this one, but these little guys. And I'm going to explain about the mold making process. But so I cast this before, and so I just wanted to show. So that is how the vase comes out of the mold. So this one is pink. So what I usually do is I cast it, and then I just put it on the shelf, and I forget about it until the next day. And then it gets completely dry, and I wear a mask and I clean it up. So that is a little bit about the casting process on this side of the studio. So now I'm going to flip you around. And yes, I'm doing that right now, Karen. So now we're on the plaster side of the studio. So there are a few different ways that I make prototypes that then make molds. So we're going to start with the one over here. So the 1-color vases that I create, grab him, were 3D printed at MakerWorks in Ann Arbor, which is a tech shop. Now a tech shop is like a gym, except instead of treadmills, they have 3D printers and laser cutters and bandsaws and all these amazing things. And so they do all the maintenance and everything, and they take care of if something breaks, they own the machines, they have all the liability and everything, and then you just pay a monthly membership, take a checkout class, and then you can use the machine. So I use their 3D printer, and I use their laser cutter to create my work. So I'm going to talk about the printer, then I'll talk about the laser cutter. So these right here are the prototypes for the vases that were printed. So I hung out with the printer for about 2 weeks and printed those, and it was, you know, twice a week, but it took a while. And then I made a mold of them. So that mold that I just showed you is of this vase right here. So then I can use that mold to recreate the vase until it wears out. Another thing I do with 3D printing is I print my handles. So there's a service called Shapeways where I upload the model online, and then they mail me a handle in this little nifty bag. Ta-da. And then I use that handle to make a rubber mold. That's what this is, rubber mold. And then I make a wax. So I pour hot wax in the rubber mold. And then I use that to make a plaster mold, which is a little like mold of a mold of a mold, but it's a process that works for me. So this right here is the handle for that mug. So I figured out that ordering from Shapeways for handles is very economical. They cost about $10. And then if the print fails, I don't have to deal with it. Anything bigger than a handle, it's much more economical for me to print it at MakerWorks. So that's why I did those. And then this year at MakerWorks, I printed a salt and pepper shaker and a creamer. Now the pink that you see on the print is Bondo because it has a very interesting surface when you print it with an extruder, like an extruding print. So I use Bondo to fill in and clean that up so that it just makes a much nicer mold. So that is the 3D printing side of my work. Now I'm going to talk about the laser cutting. So I design everything on the computer in a program called Rhinoceros. And when I was in college, I took an entire semester class on Rhinoceros and was like, ha, I'm never going to need this. Didn't really retain any of it. And then when I worked at an art center, they sent me to a workshop where I did 3D printing in Rhinoceros again, and it sort of came back to me, and now I couldn't live without it. Funny how that works. So I use a process in Rhinoceros called rail revolve, where I always start with the top of my form. I make a curve, that's the top, and then I make a profile, and then I make the piece. I do, 3 clicks, and then there it is, boom. So then I Control Z and delete it a bunch until I get it exactly how I want it. And then I take those curves, put them in Illustrator, and then I take them to MakerWorks and I laser cut them. So this right here is made of acrylic, which is just sheet plastic. And that is the track. And then this right here is a little bit complicated, but this, the piece that I laser cut is this right here. It's covered in plaster. And that I laser cut out of masonite, which is a thin hardboard. That's very cheap. It's in the Windows section at the hardware store. And I use that, and then I cut this out of flashing, which is what goes in between your roof tiles and your house. It's very thin, very flexible plastic that you can score with a knife, like a box cutter, and then you can snap it. And then I put it all together in this super overly designed thing. I glue this to the table with either hot glue gun recently or with anything that will come off without damaging my table. This is my kick wheel. Let me move this. So this kick wheel was purchased before I could drive, because my dad had to drive me there, from my sister's, at the time, boyfriend, now husband's aunt, for $45. So these are usually used for throwing, but I don't throw. So before, electricity was invented, this is how people threw on the potter's wheel. So I don't throw, so I just use it as basically a giant banding wheel. This right here is a banding wheel. And so I sit in a chair, I cast plaster over the bottom that's glued down, just cast some plaster. I know how much to cast. And then I wait until it is been about 11 minutes and it gets what we call cheese hard. It's sort of the consistency of like sour cream on its way to being cheese. And then I take everything off. I've got a little lump of plaster hanging out there, and I take my profile and I spin and I cut away at the plaster until it's perfect. So I've done this many, many times. It's very tricky to get the hang of, and it doesn't always, plaster is very finicky. But so, I mix the plaster, dump it on there, clean it off because plaster can't go in your sink. So this right here is my plaster sink. It's just a big bucket of water. And then I drag the piece. So I drag the piece and then I sand it, wet sand it. And then I come over here and I make a mold. So we're just gonna transition. This is just like that bowl, it's just smaller. So this right here is the bowl that this mold was created, much like that bowl that I'm casting over there. So I have the prototype that's been all nice and sanded, put some mold release on it. I typically, with this is my top curve collection, opposed to my bottom curve collection. So with those guys, I typically make this piece of the mold first. So I, remove this much of the mold. And then I pour this plaster on, flip it over. Let me set you down for a second so I can put the prototype. Okay, let me set the prototype in there. So then, it's almost in there. Put, pour the plaster, flip it over, and then I make the top piece by pouring the plaster on there. So that is how I make just a regular mold. Most of my molds are 2 pieces. I have a few that are 1, but that's of course the 1 color work. So I have the 1 color work and the 2 color work. This is obviously 2 colors. So there's a separate piece of the mold anywhere there's a color break in my work. And then I wanted to show right here, this is the mold that makes everybody's favorite ELO ceramic art cup. So this is my 16-ounce mug that is my most popular item. So this right here is the mold that creates that. I just last year in, it might have been the year before. But so I had 1 mold originally, and then I made another one, and I'm actually about to make another one. So with that particular piece, because I sell so many of them, I have to remake the mold every once in a while, and it's also good to have 2 molds around. So there's the handle that I printed. Here's the handle mold. And then, so this is the 2, so this one is purple and avocado. So I would cast the avocado in here, put the top piece on, cast the purple, and then attach the handle. The handle is a separate mold. So I think I saw some questions coming in, Allison. You want to?
Yes, Emily. Vince wanted to know, he said, this is a fabulous presentation. How do you discard the clay and plaster in the water buckets?
Okay, so the plaster, so my plaster is great because it settles very quickly. So my big plaster bucket will settle. I actually usually only clean it out once a year. So it's usually there's about 6 inches of plaster in the bottom, and then the rest is full of water. So I just recently cleaned it out. But what I do, ceramics is a very wasteful process. So I take the water off the top by just siphoning it out with buckets. And then when I get really close, so you don't touch the surface at all, get to the water, take all the water out. I've got buckets everywhere. And then I take the plaster out. I would use gloves because plaster molds, especially when it's wet. Use gloves, it's gonna smell like rotten eggs too, so make sure you can vent your house. And you can also pour bleach in it, that helps, lots of bleach. And then I put it in an old plaster bag. I keep all of my bags of materials. There's a bucket over there with them in there. And what I usually do is I have like a short bin, I put a grate down, and then I put the bag on it, and then I leave it in the corner for 2 weeks. All the water comes out of the plaster, and then it can be thrown away. And I just throw it in we have dumpster pickup. I throw it in, I tell my dad the trash can is particularly heavy this week. The clay is basically the same process, but it's a little bit more, it's a little bit more delicate because the clay does settle, just not as well as the plaster does. So let me come over here, show you. So my little sink this year is a little different. So up here is my bucket that I use to wash things. Over there, the Ace bucket is my bucket that I use while I'm working. And then that's my glaze bucket. I'm very particular. I have a bucket for Murphy's oil soap. I have a bucket for plaster. I have a bucket for plaster clay. I'm very particular about keeping everything separate. And then this down here is where I empty my clay water. So then that just sits. I add to it once it gets full. I come over here. I added these this year too. Save your back, everybody. Wear your Crocs. I've got my clay. So this is essentially solid throwaway clay. Over here, more solid throwaway clay. So you just gotta let it dry and throw it out. If you live on property, you can throw it in the woods. Just don't tell anybody, and don't tell anyone I said that. And the clay.
Emily, we got another question. Did you come up with your technique yourself?
So the dragging plaster is an age-old technique, and it's if you look on your ceiling in your house, and if you have molding, that is how molding was done, like back way like hundreds of years ago, like in Rome. So they threw plaster up on the ceiling and they drag it across. So that process has been adapted. I did not make it up. I learned originally from Heather May Erickson, who's another ceramic artist who lives down south. And then I learned the same thing from Hiroe Hanazono, who's a ceramic artist who lives in Philly. So they both showed me the process, and then I adapted it quite a bit to what I'm doing. So when I was in college, I used to just sort of make up lines and everything. And now with using Rhino and everything, it's what I make in the computer is almost exactly what I make out of the plaster.
Excellent. I have a couple more questions for you because we're waiting for our next musician to come online anyways.
Okay.
How long have you been doing this type of work?
So I have been working with clay for 14 years, and I've been working with slip casting for 7 years, and this particular line of work for 4 years. I had to adapt that too this year. So I started making, I started slip casting when I was in college, my sophomore year. I took the class called slip casting. I never knew about it until I did that. And then I started making this particular line of work when I started doing shows 2.5 years ago. So it's been kind of, yeah.
Excellent. And where do you draw your inspiration from for a new piece?
So my shapes come from the fact that the mold is going to work. So my process is entirely based on the mold itself. So I think of how the mold is going to work before I even think of making something. I'm not going to make something if I have to figure out the mold while I'm making it. So the bottom curve and top curve pieces were designed where the piece of the mold that you have to take apart can be the color itself. So that is it all comes from, the top and the bottom. The mold comes apart. It's just the top, that's the bottom. Because you have to when you make a mold, if there's anything holding on, your piece will get stuck and you can't take it out. I saw something about my colors.
Yeah. How do you pick your colors?
So when I was in college, I tested a bunch of commercial stains, and I just, picked them. And then when I started doing fairs full time, I narrowed it down to 6 because there's no way I could keep up with an infinite amount of colors because I have to take 6 of everything with me to a show. And then I paired the colors, just not only because some of the colors really don't look good when they're paired. I originally had 2 of the colors. I originally had the orange and avocado paired together. Then I made a piece and was like, okay, we're not doing that. So I pair them not only to make it easier for me to keep up with production, but because I think that they look good together and it's fun to have the different pairs. So I've got work over here behind me. It's a little difficult to see, but, and then I also have the one color work. And then at the very end, I'm gonna unveil my new work that I've been working on this year. I have all the molds done, but I don't have enough pieces yet to take pictures of everything for my website. A little behind because of the COVID and taking care of my family, but we're getting there. So yeah, so in my website.
Well, I was gonna ask you, Emily, what your newest piece was.
Yeah, so I have it right over here under these buckets. Ready for the reveal? So those of you who work for the Guild might have seen it already. I can bring my camera closer. So I added a whole new line this year, and this particular line has 6 different pieces, and it involves, whoops, dropped you. Uh-oh. Okay, I'm back. And it involves using all 6 of my colors. So I call this lines. So this is a lines base, and this is a lines planter. So, planter. So that comes out so that you can clean off your dish. And then I've got the different colors of slip all the way around. And then, so that one is detached. These bases are attached. So I have the lines of slip all the way around on the molds on each one, and then each one, whoops, that's my slip casting alarm. Each one has the different pieces. So that's gonna have 6 different shapes. There's 2 planters, there's a vase. So there's one planter you see there, there's a vase. There's a utensil holder, there's a mug, and there is a large bowl. Oops. And then
Awesome. And Emily, you said those aren't available yet. We know when they will be available.
in the next month, I'll have them all available. It'll be all, I'll do a big Instagram, you know, here it is, finally, I promise. Been talking about it. I'm gonna dump this mold real quick. So as you can see, I've just been talking and this has been making itself. So I dump it in the bucket over here. And then I let it drip upside down, and then I clean it up, and then it pops out of the mold just like this guy did before.
Awesome.
Any other questions?
Tell us again where we can purchase your work.
So I have my work online in my store, eloceramicart.com. This is an old sign I used to use for my old setup. So I keep everything that I have available up in my store, and I will add the lines as soon as I make 6 of everything so I can take a picture of everything. I'm starting to make it like right now, only one of the molds is still wet. The mold has to dry before I can make it. And then I will take pictures and I'll get it all up there, and it's eloceramicart.com, Emily LoPresto. And I have Instagram as well. If you want to follow me on there, I have Instagram sales, so I'll be posting things you can buy through there as well. And then I have, when we're back out in the world, I have work at the Ann Arbor Art Center, at Found in Ann Arbor, and at Pewabic Pottery, and at a gallery in Milford as well.
And hopefully at the Gutman Gallery soon.
Yes. And then hopefully I'll see everyone at an art fair this year.